So welcome to our January 2021 affiliate partner professional learning community through PatternShifts. Tonight we have Rick Tiemann with the executive group who's going to be talking with us about the amazing world of assessments. Rick has over 30 years of assessment experience, and we hope that you'll learn a lot and share a lot about your experiences around assessments as well. Rick?
All righty. Let's see if I can get this share screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes, but it's blank.
Yep, hang on, let's see if it's coming up here.
There it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right, how are we doing?
Great.
It's working.
Okay, so you may or may not have read my bio. I'm an Indiana boy, kind of born and raised and bred in Indiana. And do you folks know who David Letterman is?
Oh, yeah.
Well, David Letterman's just down the road from me in Lebanon. And I got together with him years ago, and we did this study. And we call it our official study of the top 10 reasons why managers hire. And so I thought it would be nice to kind of kick that off to kind of share with you some of the things that we've uncovered over the years of why managers hire. And so the number 10 was they dressed well for the interview. Number 9, they were personable and articulate. Number 8, they seemed to have a good sense of humor. Number 7, they'd researched the company a great deal. Number 6, they answered all the questions correctly. Number 5, they had a degree. Number 4, they seemed nice enough. Number 3, they reminded me of myself. 2, they were a friend of the family. And the number one reason why managers hire is because they were family. So there you have it. Now, my very first 2 hires were number 3. And so given all this kind of information, how do we then take away the subjective component, the emotional component of interviewing? So as I share this stuff with you tonight, most of it should resonate. But how many of you have ever made the comment to someone that says, I know a good one when I see one? Or said, I'm a pretty good judge of character. I wish I had a nickel for all the times I've heard that in 30 years. Because could you have picked John Wayne Gacy out of a lineup? So the question is that do we really know someone? And so there's a management myth that says upon promotion into management, one becomes mystically endowed with all the traits necessary to hire and create a team that gets the job done. So as I share with you some of the things I've learned in 30 years, I'm going to get a little deep into the assessment world that may be more technical than necessary, but at least it'll educate you on a level that most people are unaware of, because everything I'm going to share with you tonight is not in a manual. It's not in some J.D. Power and Associates debrief on assessments. But the right assessments will help you hire better and smarter. And I'm sure that as you kind of see where I'm going with this, you'll find what I mean about the right assessments. They're going to improve the talent management process, and learning how to build an assessment program is critical. And I think you'll see that as we kind of go through.
Rick, before we get started on that, can we just ask who is currently using assessments with your clients or within your organization, and what kinds of assessments are you using?
What are you using assessments?
Yeah, who within our group, who's on the call, what kind of, are you using assessments? And if so, what kind of assessments are you using with your clients or within your organization?
I'll jump in.
Sometimes DISC.
Sometimes
Yeah.
DISC, okay.
Yeah.
Daniel?
DISC and True Colors.
Okay.
DISC and what?
True Colors. It's a personality assessment.
I haven't seen that one. Okay. Susan and I met during DISC training back in 1993.
My God, you guys are young. Ooh. I was like 70 years old at that time.
So have you ever hired someone that didn't work out and you had to let them go?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
So Herb, who was your worst hire?
Oh my God. So, I was on a project once and I hired, this is way back in my youthful career. I'd hired this guy as a executive chef, and it was the worst hire that I've ever experienced. I terminated him within, I think, 90 days. I moved on it real quickly because this guy was just bad news, he was just doing a lot of things that were inappropriate. And I made that decision within 90 days. So that was a good thing, but a bad thing in terms of, all of the things that you listed on 10, I saw all of that. I saw him in me, so to speak. But I also saw that this guy was, he made stuff up as he goes, as he would interact with people. So, yeah.
All right, so Paul, this next one's for you. Have you ever promoted someone that didn't work out and you had to let them go?
Am I the only Paul on this call? I think
Yes.
so. Well, you know what? To be really, really honest, I got promoted and it didn't work out.
Okay.
I got promoted to manager, and what is true, what was true for me that you said earlier was I did not have the skills I needed to be a good manager, and frankly, nor the desire, which I think is a very pardon me for editorializing here, but
No,
I
it's
think
okay.
part of the process is, do you have the skills? The other is, like, from a fit or a willingness or a desire perspective, is this the right job for somebody?
Right.
So I'll just leave it there.
Well, but how many of us find it, and most of us on this call are coaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
How many of us find that we get into a coaching scenario and it's just the wrong fit, that we can coach till the cows come home, but it's not going anywhere?
Mm-hmm.
And so most of the coaching calls I've been brought in on over the years are to do damage control.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's usually a coaching is a sort of a remediation that we're going to do coaching, but we all know it's not working, but we're going to do this before we let them go.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So what happened? And then more importantly, what did you miss? So I'm going to go over some things with you, both from a selection standpoint on how assessments can be used from a selection standpoint, and how they can be used internal as a coaching tool and also as a promotional tool. There's so many facets that the right tool can use. And I've used DISC now for almost 30 years. And I can tell you that DISC is not a tool that I use for coaching.
Mm-hmm.
Just, it doesn't work. It's not deep enough. And I'll show you why. Even though I use DISC, I mean, I've gotten DISC awards for, most volume and stuff. I do not use DISC as a selection tool. I use it as part of my selection battery, but I don't use it as a selection tool, and I don't use it as a coaching tool. It's a supporting tool, and I'll show you why. But one of the reasons why hiring goes so poorly is because we tend to hire in our own likeness. And therefore we have a built-in bias that shows up in the people we hire. We like to hire people like us. Well, that's not always the right fit. But we can also think we know someone, and to your point, Paul, this gentleman, Mr. Bob, I'll call him, was the branch manager. He was hired in as a service technician, and he did a great job as a service technician. He was promoted to service manager and did a great job as service manager. And then he was promoted to branch manager. And within a year of being promoted to branch manager, there was a union organizing because of his controlling style, and they had to terminate him a year after hiring as branch manager. So how can a guy that they think they know get promoted twice to branch manager, and then he's a total debacle? Well, could we have picked that out? The next one is Miss Melissa, and I'm going to share her test results with you. But she was promoted from customer service manager to ops manager. Against our recommendation to the client not to promote her for a number of reasons, which we'll get into, 6 months after the promotion, they terminated. Then there's Doug. I was brought in to coach Mr. Doug. He was the leading sales guy, promoted to VP of sales and sales manager. 90 days into the coaching engagement, he looked at me and says, you know, I just don't think I'm cut out for sales management. So now, those are 3 real live coaching situations. Here's 2 that I only know of that are in my book. How many of you know who Jill Barad was? Jill Barad was the CEO of Mattel, but her former role at Mattel was the chief marketing officer. She was promoted from chief marketing officer to CEO of Mattel. And in 3 years after being promoted to CEO, she was fired by the very board that promoted her. What'd they miss? Then there's George Evester. He was the CFO of Coca-Cola. And upon Doug Gutierrez's passing as the CEO of Coca-Cola, Warren Buffett and the board promoted George Evester to CEO of Coca-Cola. And in less than 2 years, they fired him. So here we have 5 people that the organization knew and knew who they were, all were promoted and all failed and all were terminated. So what'd they miss? And how could they have done a better job of ferreting out or teasing out really what caused the demise? So the moral of these stories is this: past or current success is not a predictor of future success. And I hear more often than not that, well, they're successful in the role that they're in, so if we promote them, they should be okay as long as we train them and support them. And so the question becomes is, how do we tease that out? Past success is only an indicator. It's not a predictor. So how do we get past that? So what's the single biggest predictor of performance? Does anybody know? Anyone take a guess? If past performance isn't a predictor of success, what is?
This would be the interactive part.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering, is there any predictor, or is it an amalgamation of a bunch of indicators?
Well, there are a number of things, but the single biggest thing is behavior.
Yeah.
Take a look at this. Here's why we hire. Here's why we promote: experience, education, skill level, personal chemistry. And when we're interviewing, whether it's for a promotion or whether we're interviewing for a new hire, all the things on the left are that matter. And those are the things we interview for. And we ignore, and we tend to downplay or ignore what's their real attitude like, because we know they don't have their best foot forward in the interview, right? Their behavior, their interpersonal skills or lack thereof. Have you ever seen an engineer get promoted to engineering manager and then the whole department is a debacle?
Right. So Rick, I think one of the things too is that when we promote these individuals from specific job duties into a more general, in terms of running the company, their skill set, we don't prepare them, and that's where they fail. So
Correct.
I think part of what needs to be done here is obviously prepare someone, especially if you're considering them for that promotion. You know, they tend to work well in their current position, but beyond that, when they have to run multiple departments and diverse groups, they're incapable of doing it.
Yeah, and we so frequently promote for their experience or their professional knowledge, not their management or leadership ability. So I agree with you here, but we do not prepare people because it requires a totally other skill set.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I'm coaching based on a discipline situation versus coaching on a career path, those are 2 different coaching models, right?
Correct.
So, and when we look at the reason most people are terminated is for poor performance and personality. We don't typically fire them because they don't understand the job. So we need a way to figure out how can we determine if this person has the right characteristics to succeed in that role. So can we predict performance? This is an actual email I got from a client. It says, it looks like things are going well with the book. Would you be able to take a look at Mr. B's readback? You told us he had a temper and strongly suggested we should not hire. We are looking at termination. Obviously they didn't listen, right? He used his fist to break a machine controller and has had several outbursts. I have some Facebook posts that make me very uncomfortable. That's an actual email from a client. This client's been with me for 27 years. And still every now and then, so the reason this person was hired is because he had all the technical skills they needed for second shift, and they thought they could make it work, even though I told them results suggest he's got a temper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, those of you who are, how many of you are DISC users? Can the DISC tell you if there's anger in that personality? Nope, can't. You can get an indication by the shift between graph 1 and graph 2. So if graph 1, of course, in the new DISC model, they don't have the graphs anymore. They've got little dots in a circle. But anyway, so we're going to get into that, okay? Now, in an ideal world, when we talk about behavior as the biggest predictor, would you agree that the behaviors that are listed on this particular slide are in fact the kind of behaviors we wish we could hire to?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so if we could find a way to predict a person's emotional resilience or has a good balance, sorry about that. I don't know what to. So, or seeks feedback and asks for constructive criticism, can the DISC tell us those things about those behavioral components we're looking at right here? How many of you use the Myers-Briggs?
Years ago.
Reads like a horoscope, doesn't it?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Now, let's take a look at.
How about Berkman, Rick?
So the Berkman is very similar to the DISC. It measures it in 4 quadrants, and those quadrants are color coded.
So
Berkman,
the idea of those 2 assessments telling you about how someone operates in a stress mode, does that point back to behavior?
yes, it does, because it's part of the anxiety domain.
All right.
So when we think of anxiety, people kind of their hand wringers or worriers or the Chicken Little syndrome, those are tendencies that fall under the domain of anxiety. When you look at the DISC measures dominance, right? So the D is dominance, the I is influencing, the S is steady, and the C is compliant. So the DISC is good in team building or as a general conversation piece. But one of the ways to look at a DISC profile in the original factors is the shift in the graphs. But would you say that these behaviors are in fact problematic and often the cause of termination? So wouldn't it be cool if we had a tool that could predict those behaviors?
Yes.
What about these? These are a little bit more egregious. Look at these characteristics.
I think the first one describes me.
Can you say a little more, Susan? Because I didn't know that.
She's a rebel.
I knew that. All right. Okay. So, but what I'm trying to get you to see is that are these behaviors that I'm portraying on these 2 slides I've just shared with you, are those behaviors that show up in an interview?
Usually not.
No, because you manage that. You manage that, right?
Yeah. So when is it these behaviors start to manifest themselves? How long?
After 90 days.
Yeah.
Usually.
After the probationary period, right?
Usually.
After you can't get your money back from the recruiter.
Exactly.
Sometimes they show up at the interview dinners.
Oh.
Yes, they
They've
can.
had a few
Yeah.
glances of wine. Then
Yeah,
you
it
see
really
this
shows
stuff,
up,
right?
Janice.
Right, I've seen this at interview dinners, some of
Yep.
it.
Yep. And so, but you need to have at least 3 interviews before their natural tendencies start to emerge
Right.
in their true self. The funniest one I ever did was one of my clients up in Rapid City, South Dakota, wanted me to help interview an individual that worked for them years ago. And I couldn't be there because I was out of town. So we did it via phone. So the general manager, the HR manager, and the sales manager were in the room with the candidate. I was on the phone, and this candidate kept dodging my questions. And so I wouldn't let that go, and I'd circle back a little later and kind of push again. True story, as much as we're all sitting here. They told me this later. I made this guy so mad he literally broke the pencil in the meeting. But he wouldn't, he kept avoiding everything. So, but anyway, if you have an assessment that can give you this kind of depth of information, it's going to aid in your coaching because you can really get at what the triggers really are. And I can't with the disc. So I'm going to show you how to use it as a coaching tool as we go along as well. Now, the problem lies in the interview model that the technical competence and the job competence are what winds up being interviewed. Your planning skills, delegating, conflict resolution, those things on a technical competence and the job competence is what most interviews are framed around. Very little time is spent around the personal competence. And most first interviews last about an hour. Is that true?
At least, yeah.
Can you get through all these things in an hour and tease all this out in an hour? No way. So you've got to have some kind of assessment that helps you bridge the gap and dig deeper quicker to give you some of the relevant information that you need to make a stronger decision on either a hire or a promotion or even coaching.
So Rick,
Yep.
what I've seen throughout my career, particularly where the space I was in, we would do panel interviews and we'd do multiple interviews. So that person could literally, I mean, on a personal note, I got interviewed 25 times. So how does that work from what you're describing to having those panel and multiple interviews?
So we were hiring a senior accountant for NIPSCO, the Northern Indiana Public Service Company. 9 people had interviewed them in their panel interview. They had me come in and interview the guy in test. I told the guy, it's been a long time ago, I forget his name now, but I told the guy, I said, look, my test results suggest that these are some things that I'm concerned about, and my interview tended to support that. So he said, well, that's interesting because your results are different from everyone that's interviewed him, including the panel. And so how do we tease out whether or not your information has any merit? So I said, well, let's do one more interview with you and I and the candidate and someone who's not met this person yet, and let me lead the interview piece. And the guy bombed, literally bombed in the interview. So the hiring manager immediately got on the phone after the candidate left and called the search firm and tried to find out what was going on. They said, well, we knew he had some challenges. We were trying to help him work through those in the interview process. So I'm going to show you some assessments, not just one, but several that I use that help me tease out and go deeper. But here's something that I think is really important to understand. It's not what a test tells you, it's what it doesn't tell you. For example, let's take the disc since everybody's familiar with disc. The D is the dominance, right? Well, dominant people can have aggressive tendencies, can they not?
Yes.
But when you read a disc profile and you get someone who has the high D in the disc, they'll tell you they're competitive, but they don't tell you they're aggressive. So it doesn't give you
like
the
Susan, like Susan.
Talking about her.
Herb, I think that's called projecting in psychology.
Yeah.
People from Queens, we don't play, okay?
Right. So the second piece of this is not what a test doesn't tell you, it's what it can't tell you. So the men in the room will appreciate this. If I go to get my blood tested, my cholesterol tested, my triglycerides tested, and they leave out the PSA test, I'm leaving out a critical piece of understanding about my medical history that's left out.
Do the women know what PSA is?
Public service announcement. I'm going to
That's
shut
all.
up
I
now.
love it. I love it. So PSA is part of the prostate. So it's a piece of my anatomy that doesn't get measured because that particular part of the test is left off. Well, the vast majority of assessments do not measure anger and aggression. They don't measure anxiety. Well, if it doesn't measure it, how can it predict it? This is where the DISC has its limitations. Even though I love it as a tool, it has its limitations. And whether it's predictive index or Berkman or the others. Now, there are many ways to measure something, right? I can use a ruler, a yardstick, a tape measure, a micrometer, or laser. But what's going to give me the most amount of accuracy? It's the laser. So I have to have something that digs deeper. So think of the DISC assessment or a predictive index as something that's simple, and a psychological test is more sophisticated. Let's look at the differences. Simple assessments measure generally 4 behaviors. Look at what DISC measures. Look what Berkman measures. Sophisticated assessments measure more. Most sophisticated tools get into what's called the Big Five theory. Some of you may have heard of the Big Five theory. How is the trait measured? Are words used or questions used? Is it forced choice or multiple choice? How many questions define the trait? These are some of the things that start to look at what's called test construct. If you look at the DISC, it has 28 boxes of words, and each box has 4 words. You choose one word that describes you the most, one word that describes you the least. It's a very simple measure of behavior. Now, here's a pretty simple test. Some people can't even pass this, but you get my drift, right? Or can you find the aardvark hiding in the truck? Or can you get through the maze? Or word problems, right? So these are some of the more simple ones that are on the market. But anyway.
Can we go back to the maze? No, I'm kidding.
Okay, now, so here's a list of some of, and I say some of, the assessments on the market. How many of you know at least 6 of these?
I know 2.
Okay.
4.
So what are the 2, what of the 2 that you know, which are those?
Myers-Briggs and DISC.
Okay. All right. Who had the 4?
Myers-Briggs, DISC, MMPI, and Berkman.
Okay. Which test can you not use in a pre-employment setting?
DISC.
Nope, you can use DISC in pre-employment. DISC is not recommended by DISC as a pre-employment tool, but you can use it.
Oh, okay. That's true.
Step back. I know the typing test.
So the MMPI is the only test there that you can't use in a pre-employment setting.
What is that?
MMPI stands for Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It is a clinical assessment.
Right.
It measures mental health. So it can only be used by a clinical psychologist and can only be used post-offer, like a blood test or drug test or urine test.
Right. Hey, Rick, I didn't see strength finders on this.
Because it's not a personality test, it's an abilities test.
Okay.
It's more of motivation and interest.
Okay.
So there's a Holland, what's called a Holland test. There's what's called a Murray. Those are 2 that we use as part of our battery that measures motivation and interest. So Strengths Finders is a little bit different. Phiro B would tend to fall in that line. But how many of you know which ones are behavioral tests, which ones are reasoning tests, which ones are psychological tests, which ones are clinical tests? Can you pick out which ones are which?
No,
No.
I can't.
Yeah, I'm
No.
just familiar with. Yeah.
Let me help you.
Okay.
So how would anybody know, your clients included, you included, that a client wants you to use a specific test to evaluate someone? How would you know what to use? And how would you know if it's any good?
Just call Rick.
My point is that in all the research for a little over 30 years of research, I've taken most, if not all of these, and understand the differences and nuance. They're all basically computer generated, but the difference being your basic behavioral tests like the DISC or extended DISC. How many of you heard of extended DISC? Okay. There's also a culture index that I don't have on there. That came out of, that's an extension of predictive index. So, but how many people out there are actually out there selling any one of these or these tests as a whole?
Oh, thousands.
Lots of people,
And how many people do you think really know what the heck they're selling?
not many.
I'm going to sell you a disc. I don't know how to interpret it, but I'll give you the report.
I just had that conversation with somebody today who said that they had had a DISC assessment and they weren't that impressed with it because it didn't tell them anything. And I thought, well, maybe it's, you know, it could be how it was presented to them with somebody who didn't really know or understand it.
Well, that too, but you know, when you think about how complex human behavior is,
Yeah.
Right.
and you look at how simplified DISC tries to make a complex aspect of behavior,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
It's oversimplified. So sometimes people go, yeah, I know that about me.
But tests like Myers-Briggs, why would anybody use that for recruiting purposes? It's not a recruiting tool. It's a
I know
preference
that,
test.
but
Yeah.
I agree, but
Yeah.
you would be surprised in 30 years of working with clients and hiring what they use.
So they
Yeah.
look for an extrovert, for instance. We need an extrovert on this project.
Yeah, and so that's how they
Crazy.
define it, right?
Crazy. Yeah.
All right. So now that you've got an idea of the kinds of assessments that are out there and how they're classified, okay? I've seen organizations have as many as 3 or 4 assessments that they use within the organization.
Mm.
So people get confused. Well, which ones am I supposed to use for this? Well, there are very few assessments that work across the entire organizational lines. And my preferred test, let me go back. So I use the 16PF. I'll show you which ones I use. I use about a half a dozen of these, often in combination. I'll use skills tests. I've got several clients that I help them hire their technicians. So we'll use either mechanical concepts and the Ramsey electrical. So we may use different tests. We will incorporate different reasoning tests in terms of looking at kind of the intellectual part of the job. We may use some reasoning tests in there. So I'll show you what we do to create what we call a battery. When we do an executive workup, we use 6 different assessments. So these are the ones that we'll use in combination based on a given situation. So how many of you heard of the Hogan?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Hogan's a good tool. I use it. I only use it for high profile. Hogan has its limitations. There's some stark contrast between the 16PF and the Hogan, which I'll show you when I get into some case studies. But this is the technical side. It's going to get boring, but I'll blow through this real quick. But there's validity, reliability, test construct, distortion, how the traits are measured and how deep the traits are measured determines the quality of the assessment that you're using. And the behavioral assessments that are listed there from the DISC and Berkman and Caliper, Myers-Briggs, those are more simple approaches to the elements of behavior. The psychological assessments usually will follow along what's called the Big Five theory. And the biggest differentiator in that whole group is that the psychological assessments measure behavior deeper and broader in context. Well, from a technical standpoint, validity and reliability are the two most important things. A test is considered good when it's both valid and reliable. But most people have only heard the term validity, not reliability. And reliability is its consistency over time. The DISC does not have a consistency over time. It falls in pretty much in line, but not exactly. But validity is a particular situation. Reliability tells you if the test is trustworthy. There's construct, content, and criterion validity. So in terms of test validity, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, right? Who validates what's been validated? On that list of tests that I shared with you, there are several tests that have never been validated by an outside source. They've only been validated by their own internal research. It's kind of like General Motors doing their own crash test. But you wouldn't know which one did or didn't unless you knew where to look. And the place to look is called a mental measurements yearbook. It's called the Burroughs Mental Measurements Yearbook. So a reliable test will have a coefficient of 0.70 or greater. Myers-Briggs has a test retest coefficient of 0.5. Construct validity is about, it measures what it says it's going to measure. And again, if you want to spend more time, we can. Content validity is about kind of what meets the criteria for the aspect of the job. So we've done a ton of validation studies for behaviors for specific job roles. Criterion delivery shows a study of people scoring high on tests of extroversion made good as people in cold calling, much to Janice's point on looking for someone on this team that's extroverted. So those are the kinds of things. Now, how many people have used Myers-Briggs? Okay.
Long time ago.
All right. So here's my Myers-Briggs.
Not happy with that.
All right. So in this, the ENTP and INTP, the ENT stands for extroversion, right? The E is the extroversion, the I is the introversion. Well, on any given day, I might be an ENTP, but more often I'm probably an INTP. But let's look at my DISC. So Myers-Briggs, I'm moderately extroverted, right? Look at my DISC. What does that tell you about my extroversion? So do those line up?
No.
Not at all. So if you're just using Myers-Briggs, you wouldn't get a true picture. If you look at my DISC, you get a different picture. But does the Myers-Briggs measure dominance?
No.
So how would you know which test to use if you were going to look into what based on the role, right? Now, Janice, to your point, very few people have I seen use the Myers-Briggs for a selection, but I have seen companies do use it in part of their process, if you will. But they don't know any better. And most companies don't know any better. Most companies use what somebody else used or what somebody else said this is good and we use it and it works or it's okay. Very companies know how to do the research or what to look for. And oftentimes it comes down to price. So you can get a Myers-Briggs for what, 50 bucks? I sell DISC for 75. But when I do an executive battery, I sell it for 1,200. So now you get an idea of my DISC profile, my Myers-Briggs, but neither of them really give you the depth of who I really am because you're only looking at 4 parts to my personality. Now, how many of you heard of predictive index?
Yeah.
So predictive index is it's been highly promoted, but they use what's called an ABCD. Their A is dominance, their B is influencing, C is steadfast, D is compliant. If you look at their training material, you wonder who plagiarized who. The tests are constructed differently. The DISC has 28 boxes of words with 4 words in each box. The predictive index has 96 words on one page. You turn it over, it's got 96 words on the other page. You check off which words you feel describe you the most. There's your graph. There you have your 4 dimensions, and you're off and running, and you've got another test. So The next thing is what we call test-taking mentality. Well, what does that really mean? David, you got any idea what that really means?
It's just, when you skew these tests based on how you think you are versus how you actually are. Is that what
Exactly.
it's referring to?
Right, exactly. So how do you know then, in someone takes the DISC or Myers-Briggs, how do you know that they're not skewing to try to make them look like somebody different than what you're looking for versus who they really are?
I look at those as self-assessments, not true assessments.
Correct.
I'm sorry, I said it again, David. I missed that.
Yeah, these as self-assessments and not what I would call reliable, excuse me, valid assessments.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Yep. David, you're absolutely right. And I want to show you how we get by that, or we get by that, but I'm going to show you the assessment that we use that helps us understand exactly where their head's at, and if they're skewing the results or trying to show us someone else, or whether they're faking because of how the tests are constructed. Because there's what's called distortion scales, which neither the Myers-Briggs or most of the others don't have what we call distortion scales. So in the tool that I use as my primary tool, there are 3 different distortion scales. There's an impression management scale, an infrequency scale, and an acquiescence scale. Those 3 scales tell me about test taker integrity, not test integrity. That's different. It's test taker integrity. So were they being honest, or were they being more manipulative, or were they hiding in what we call hiding in the profile? And your more sophisticated assessments can tell you if they're hiding in the profile or if they're overstating self or over exaggerating self. But you need a test that measures, that provides you some type of distortion component to it. Now, when we look at emotional intelligence, and I think Janice, you've done some work in emotional intelligence. Was that your bio I'd read on?
Yep. I've done some. I wouldn't say, I don't consider myself really an expert in emotional intelligence.
Okay.
Done a bit of work there.
All right. So when you think of emotional intelligence, this comes out of the work of Goleman in a book called Primal Leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And he really breaks it down quite nicely in terms of differentiating the personal competence, how they manage themselves, self-awareness, self-management, self-insight, versus the social awareness and the relationship management. And again, the DISC doesn't break it down, or Myers-Briggs, the vast majority don't break this down deep enough to understand the nuances and the components that underline or underpin these characteristics. So if I have an assessment then that helps me dig into these things at a deeper level, I can get an idea of where their triggers lie. And I'm going to share with you as we get into case studies. So I use the 16PF as my primary tool, and we can do Q&A later to get into that if you got more questions around that. But a gentleman named Dr. Steve O'Shaughnessy I was teamed up with him, a company called Corporate Express, which was bought out by Staples eventually. I did all the US and North America executives, and Dr. O'Shaughnessy did all the European executives for Corporate Express. And we compared notes on which assessments we were going to use for the project. And the key tool he used was, in fact, the 16PF. And I said, well, why did you choose that? He said, because I believe it's the gold standard of psychological test. Interesting enough, he also used the Hogan. So we were often running to be able to combine and compare and contrast using the same assessments across the pond with the 16PF and the Hogan to evaluate all the executives for Corporate Express. So what is the 16PF and why is it my silver bullet, if you will? Even though I will use Hogan or I will use DISC, why is 16PF my go-to? Well, I've used it for 30 years. I've done over 20,000 assessments using the 16PF alone. So I've got a little bit of experience with it. But when you break it down, tough-mindedness is a factor that measures whether a person is more intuitive and artistic or more analytical and detailed in their thinking, more practical, pragmatic, more grounded versus more artistic. The self-control measures self-discipline, organization, rules. Workplace coping skills measures anxiety. Interpersonal skills would correlate to the DISC to some degree. I'll show you the difference in a minute. The independence score would correlate a lot to the dominance of the DISC. And the problem solving is something that most assessments don't have. About the only assessment on that whole list I shared with you was the Profiles XT. It has a pretty robust problem solving piece, but it only measures 9 dimensions of behavior. Not a bad tool. Wiley Books just bought the rights to Profiles International and the DISC model. So Wiley Books is now getting into the assessment world. Of course, we know the owner of Berkman just passed away, so we don't know what's up with that. But you know, there's so many out there. How do you know which ones to use? But I use this one for a number of reasons. It measures of those dimensions we just looked at. It breaks it down into 16 different subdimensions. And here's a left and a right meaning. So on each of these characteristics. So I'll give you a chance to kind of glance at to kind of the left and right meaning. But there are 16 factors that are measured versus 4 of the DISC or 4 of the Myers-Briggs. And I think you can start to begin to see how we can get deeper into the behaviors. And I'm going to take you back to the slides I gave you on the problematic behaviors. I'm going to show you how we can predict those problematic behaviors using the combinations of these traits. Now, there's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Carson, who I've worked with for 25 years, who's a clinical psychologist who is one of the foremost authors and experts on the 16PF in clinical practice. He taught all the incoming clinical psychologists on how to use 16PF in clinical. He identified 15 problematic or what we called unreliable behaviors that were part of his work in a book called 16PF in Clinical Practice. Now, let me go back. So of these 16 items, there are actually 32 dimensions, aren't there? Everybody follow why I say that?
Yeah.
Left and right meaning, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, now,
Mhm.
of those 32 dimensions, 15 of them are potentially, I want to qualify potentially, abnormal. So let's take the very top left where it says reserved, impersonal, distant. In and of itself, if you're a lighthouse guard on the East Coast or the West Coast, that factor is probably not an issue. If you're a process engineer, that factor is probably not an issue. So the abnormal behaviors are what we call unreliable behaviors. So a low score in that dimension signals a potential of social withdrawal. Well, in and of itself, that's not so bad, but in certain situations, it may be problematic. Then there's low reasoning, there's low frustration tolerance, there's low submissiveness. Everybody catch my drift now?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the DISC or Myers-Briggs or Caliper or Berkman, all the others, only look at natural, normal behavior, not abnormal behavior, not maladaptive. Everybody know what I mean by maladaptive versus adaptive behavior? All right. So these traits you're looking here measure maladaptive, the potential for maladaptive behavior. And in the work we've done for the last 30 years, we've advised clients that if 3 or more of these traits show up on an individual's assessment results, we suggest to possibly move on. And you can see why, right?
Oh, Rick, only 3 out of these 15?
Well, 3 or more.
Okay.
Now, let me share this next. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I worked with a guy by the name of Dr. Neil Ratton out of Connecticut. And he's a clinical psychologist that works with people with substance abuse issues. And we came across each other's work at a joint client out in Massachusetts. And he asked me if the 16PF could predict substance abuse issues. I said, well, I don't know that it'll predict substance abuse as much as it would identify potential problematic behaviors that align with people with substance abuse. Okay. So we worked to put together a study of substance abuse. So let me slip that before I get into that. So remember the slides I gave you on problematic behavior?
Mm-hmm.
We can predict that by the combinations of these patterns. So let's go down kind of the middle where it says anger and aggressive tendencies, E plus, L plus. Everybody see me?
Yes.
All right, now let's go back to the abnormal behaviors. Look at low on L plus suspicion. Suspicion has a component to anger. Well, let's go back. So look in the middle there where it says L, trusting and accepting to the left, and vigilant, suspicious, skeptical, and wary to the right. We know that when people score high on that scale, there's a lot of anger that goes with it. Remember the email I read to you that of the client that said they had a guy put a fist through his controller? He scored high on that dimension, which was an indicator that there was some aggressive tendencies. Now, let's look at the E score on cooperative to the left or dominant, forceful to the right. That'd be like the high D on the disc. Imagine a person with a highly dominant nature, with a highly degree of anger or skepticism. What do you think happens when those two traits collide?
Disaster.
Yep. Now, so this is how, with a more sophisticated tool, we can pick out problematic behavior that most people would never be able to see in an interview or uncover unless they really knew what they were doing and really knew how to use an assessment that could evaluate the depth of behavior you need to look at when you're either coaching, hiring, or promoting.
So Rick, I have a question.
Yep.
You know, America is known to use 80% of the world's illicit drugs. Right? I read that some 10 years ago.
Okay.
So what my concern is here is you have these indicators or subcategories, right?
Right.
So when you have so many people with addictive personalities or, you know, in some sense considered substance abusers, how does it separate the person who is casual versus significant abuser, or does
Well, it doesn't, but let me share with you, stay on that thought because we're going to get there. Okay.
Okay, sure.
All right. Now let's take a look at these traits that were a little bit more egregious, right? We'll look at the factors. Now, in this example, I'm sharing two factors that feed those. In this one, I'm sharing that there's 2, 3, maybe even 4 factors that then you look at. Well, most computer generated reports can't pick out the depth of these things that I can pick out with the naked eye because of my experience behind using this particular tool and the number of years and the number of times I've used it. But let's look at does not cope with things in general, -C and O+. Right? So let's go back and look at what a -C looks like. So -C is a low frustration tolerance. You see that? Third one from the left.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then look at the second one from the top on the right, worry, O+. All right. So now we've got low frustration tolerance and high worry. All right. So we've got low C, O+, does not cope with things in general. So why does that correlate then to that basic comment when we see, so those are 2 of the 15 potential abnormal behaviors. Now, why is this of value? How could this be of value to you in a coaching engagement?
Well, it tells you, you know, what that person's potential strengths and weaknesses are. And I think it would allow for you to guide or allow you to coach more appropriately because you understand where that person's deficit or whatever it is might be.
And it also helps you identify whether or not the coaching model is going to work or whether they really need therapy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And I'm going to show you
That's
that.
a little bit deeper than for me, the clinical
Yeah.
piece. Yeah.
Rick,
Okay,
that
now-
was actually the question I was just going to raise is since these are used in clinical settings, I'm very interested in where that line is. I mean,
Yeah. Well,
certainly as in multiple, as a teacher, as a professor, as a coach, you come into the, I'm interested to hear you talk about how you know those lines and then what you do.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, keep in mind the 16PF is not a clinical test. It's a psychological test.
No, but you've mentioned these things working with clinicians and kind of in that, and to Herb's point, right? And what you just said, is this therapy, is this coaching? I'm just,
Yep.
you're touching on it. I just think that's an important point.
Yep.
Sure.
And I'll give you a couple case studies where that's been the case. Okay. All right. So now you catch my drift about having an assessment that has the ability to really analyze the depth of human behavior we need as coaches or people who are making recommendations to hire or promote. You with me so far? Questions? Because this can get pretty complex. So look at look at the second one from the top on this, E plus, L plus, Q1 plus. Aggressive and angry at the world, has a chip on their shoulder and prone to fight. So if we can predict, if we have a kind of assessment that can predict those behaviors, how valuable or even invaluable can that be in your coaching model? Or, I mean, how many of you people help companies hire people? That's a huge part of what we do. But now, so let's go back to these 15 unreliable behaviors. In our substance abuse study, we had 142 confirmed substance abuse users that were screened using our screening process based on a series of questions that they had to answer. And we didn't take everybody because we screened out of 600 people, we screened it down to 142. But the ones in red had the highest correlation to people with substance abuse issues. See that?
Yeah.
Now, in our model, we tell clients that if there are 2 or more what we call areas of potential concern, that we recommend to pass or look very stringently at what's really going on before they move on. If there are 3 or more and other factors all being equal. So we've tracked for 30 years of doing this, we've tracked every applicant that clients have hired. We took 5,000 applicants for our applicant pool, and we applied these cutoff scores to the applicant group and to the substance abuse group. Utilizing our cutoff model with these traits, we would have only eliminated 5.7% of the standard group versus 75% of the substance abuse group. And using a 2 or more cutoff with the WCS's workplace coping skills less than 4 and self-control less than 4, we would only eliminated 9% of the job applicant group, but we would eliminated 81% of the control group. So in our substance abuse study, we can unequivocally show clients where they're possibly at risk in hiring certain people who may or may not have substance abuse issues, but they've got the behavioral issues that align with people with substance abuse problems. Doesn't mean they're substance abuse users, but the unproductive behaviors are the concerns in that hiring group.
So Rick, I think that's an important point of clarification. We're not using this as a diagnostic by any means. It's to determine behaviors that we don't want in our workplace, correct?
Yes, sir. Exactly. Great point. Thank you. Thank you. That's a great point, David.
And Rick, what are the legal ramifications of using assessments like this
Great question.
to weed out individuals?
So virtually every assessment on the market can be used in a pre-employment setting other than the MMPI.
Okay.
Because it measures mental health. So,
So,
go
so
ahead.
an applicant who doesn't get selected, who went through this battery of assessments, has no recourse to go back to the organization or
No.
to your organization because of that.
Right. So everything we use, it meets EEOC, affirmative action, and disparate impact.
So here's $1 million question. Do you share, for example, someone that may show the behaviors of a substance abuser, those descriptions, do you share that information with that person if they are not
No.
recruited? Okay.
No. So when people come on, when clients use us and people come onto our site to go the assessment, they have to sign a hold harmless agreement and acknowledge the fact that this information will not be shared unless they're hired.
Okay.
And we encourage clients to share this information once they're hired and an onboarding process, so that the hiring manager and the employee can get off on the same foot on how to be managed, how they like to be managed, how they work. In other words, if I get hired by someone who's a micromanager, that's going to be a disaster.
Yeah. So this could also be used as a training tool or for growing someone professionally as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have 13 coaching executives going on right now. Most of them are for promotion, that we're working on promotional.
Yeah.
Okay, now, so we can get as deep into the traits of a salesperson, a technician. We're working with another client right now. We've done 2 validation studies on looking at the behaviors for technicians in 2 different industries. One's the heavy duty industrial, one's in the aftermarket and the fire and safety world. So we can look at getting down to granular on specific job classes or specific positions or roles and the behaviors we want in those roles. And we can create customized reports that show whether or not that person falls within the parameters of the behaviors we're looking for in that given role. So here's a sales profile from our sales report we've created that shows the candidate, shows the client if that candidate falls in line with expectations for what we find in a typically strong sales profile, whether or not they fall in or outside the parameters. It doesn't mean don't hire. We don't tell clients not to hire. We show them why they maybe shouldn't hire, but at the end of the day, it's their call.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, going back to your top 10 list, they could be a number 1. So they're going to get hired anyway.
That's right. That's right. Yep. Oh, listen, I've got, anyway. Okay.
I'm sure you got some stories.
Oh my God. Yeah. All right. So now let me share with you case studies. Does anybody want to take a quick break? We're good?
Oh, good.
I'm okay.
All right. Now, let me share. These are all case studies. These are all live examples of how we use assessments to help our clients. Now, this particular individual, the client also asked me to check the references on this particular one. Now, we've used a DISC, right? So in a sales role, sales business development role, manufacturing world, manufacturing environment, installations and what have you, equipment installations, from a purely DISC profile, does this line up as a typical salesperson? Just a DISC.
Possibly.
No, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, influential.
The D seems a little low,
Yeah.
but
But I mean, the I is high, so.
but the I is high.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
It could pass, right?
yeah.
Right. In other words, we wouldn't disqualify this candidate if we just looked at the DISC, would we?
Correct.
Okay. Now, and I mentioned I use multiple assessments because I create what I call a battery. So let's look in the bottom right-hand corner. You see the WG symbol there?
Where is this?
Bottom right-hand
Yes,
corner.
yes. Yeah, WG2.
Yep.
Yeah.
So 30, that's a 40 problem test that measures inductive and deductive reasoning. So she got 30 out of 40 right. So at looking at her ability to size things up, evaluate things, look at how things fit together on the shop floor, work in an engineering environment. She's got strong inductive and deductive reasoning, okay? That CF stands for culture fair. That's a short IQ test. It's all based on pictures and diagrams. It's called a spatial relationship test. It measures perceptual reasoning or innate IQ. 18 out of 20 on her spatial relationship. And then the L, Q, and T, the L stands for linguistic. The Q is the quantitative, the T is the total. So her math and verbal skills are acceptable. They're in the 39th percentile based on general sample. So we notice she's got the intellectual horsepower to manage a job in technical sales and work within the confines of putting equipment together, tearing equipment down, revamping equipment. She's got the intellectual problem-solving ability to support that. Well, most assessments don't have that, so we build that in our battery. You see why? Now, let's look at her 16 PF results. Well, look at the very top score, A of 10, sociable. So she's telling us that she's friendly, outgoing, people-oriented, relationship-oriented, right? Go down to the third one from the bottom where it says works in groups.
Mm-hmm.
So she says, I like to work with people. I like to work with teams. I like to be part of a team. So those two correlate then. And look at the global factors on the right where it says EX. EX stands for extroversion. It correlates to the eye of the disc. So now I've got two confirming patterns, a high extroversion scale, and I've got an eye on the disc. And so stands to reason that I've got someone who's very social, very personable, very outgoing. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't have necessarily, even though I know this trait is potentially part of her personality, I wouldn't have picked it out because she seems to have a pretty dominant, pretty confident style. How do I see that? Well, look at the D of the disc. There's the dominance. Now go up and look at the E score on assertiveness. It's a 7. With me?
We're okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
Thank
drop
you.
down, Susan, 3 more to socially bold.
Is that Susan's assessment?
No.
I'm just checking.
Okay, so we know she's socially bold, outgoing, competitive driven with a high social profile. Fits a sales profile, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
she's smart. Her references checked out. 3 good references. 4 months into the engagement, the client calls me and he says, why are we having problems with this gal? I said, what are you having problems with? She says, she seems to be argumentative and temperamental. Well, so every strength has an inherent weakness. So she becomes petulant and pouts when she doesn't get her way. So there's a high need to be liked. That's the A score of 10 and the Q2 score of 2. And then see the I score of 5 on sensitive.
Does she have an entitlement characteristic as well?
Yep, that's the Q1 score.
Okay.
So she likes to argue her point. So she's been held out of certain meetings as of late because of COVID. Well, she's gotten obstinate. Well, it stands to reason because she's competitive, she's pushy. So if you're interested, I'll send you the generic write-up without the name on it. I'll send everybody the write-up that I did when I did the results, and then I'll send you the write-up I did after we did a little bit more research on what's going on with the client and the challenges and how to coach her.
Well, why was she held out of the COVID meetings? She wasn't wearing her mask or something?
No, there were some clients that wanted an engineering support at the plant. And so the owner and the chief engineer went and they excluded her because they were only allowed 2 people. And she kept pushing the issue on why she should be there.
Okay, gotcha.
Right?
So
Now,
I guess what this is saying though is, you can use this as an indicator, but because the profile still fits, this is now a good coaching candidate because she's got the right mix.
Yeah, right.
correct.
Right. Good point.
Rick,
And
we've
what-
got about 15 minutes left.
Okay, cool. All right, let's jump on. Now, this is one that I suggested the client not hire for senior project coordinator. And they went ahead and hired anyway, and 2 weeks later they fired her. So now they also hired right behind her an engineer that I suggested not to hire, and they fired him in the first week. Now they listen to everything I tell them. So why did I see this one as more problematic as a project coordinator? Well, if you really look at the behaviors, you could say, you could build a case on why she might do a good job. Seems highly conscientious, seems very organized, seems very diligent, pushes herself and hard on herself, very confident, very open to change, very willing to take on responsibility. And they saw all of that in the first 2 weeks. But what I told them was, I see a negative side to this that may have more downside than upside. And that's because she believes that all of her answers are the correct ones and doesn't want to listen to others. She tends to be pushy and obstinate and tries to get her own way and doesn't work well within the confines of the group and isn't necessarily the best team player. Well, 2 weeks in, that's what they saw, and they fired her. So you have to sometimes really dig deep into these profiles. I'm going to skip this one. Well, this one's an easy one. Look in the bottom right-hand corner where the culture fair score is an 83, right? Average IQ is 100. His is 83. He's applying for a quality control manager. This one's very interesting, but he didn't have the horsepower. He's in the 2nd percentile on his math and verbal scores. We weren't using the Watson Glaser on this one, but this is one of my favorites. It's in my book called Developing World-Class Leaders. This gets back to who asked the question about the clinical side on therapy?
It was Tommy.
Okay, so Tommy, here's where this falls in. Okay, this is a person who is smart as a whip. Look at the IQ at the bottom, 118 IQ, 87th percentile, 70th percentile on her math and her verbal. Smart leader. She helped them write the ISO manuals, helped them put them on ISO compliance, could run circles around any 2 customer service reps in the department, knew the business, knew the clients loved her, but she was hell on wheels. Condescending, arrogant, aggressive. So look at the E and the L scores. Remember I talked about aggressive tendencies?
Yeah.
Now look at this, look at the C score. Easily upset.
Hold on. So E, submissive. Talk a little bit about that.
E is assertive, or E is a 9.
Okay.
Look at the D on the disc.
So I'm just trying to track here. So she's easily upset, very assertive, and highly suspicious.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not great.
No.
So she just gets triggered and goes into overdrive.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
she's really smart, so she's tracking a lot. So there's more
Yep.
opportunities for this to happen.
Yeah.
Right. So now,
Especially when she's looking at the data. Hey, Rick, I didn't realize that this program also does the IQ until you mention it.
yeah, well, I have to add other tests to do that.
Oh, okay. All right.
Right. So now here's the backdrop. So the owner says, we want to promote from within. We know she's got the talent. We know she doesn't have the temperament. You're going to coach her and we're going to promote her. I said, wrong. He said, what do you mean? I said, in all honesty, she needs therapy and I don't think she'll accept the coaching. And I said, and I'm not being facetious here at all. So look at the global factors on the right-hand corner. See the EX, the last person had a 10 on EX. Look at the ER score below that. It's a 7. The ER stands for emotional resilience. So what goes into emotional resilience? There are 4 of those 15 abnormal behaviors. 4 of those 15 are part of the emotional resilience domain, or what we call the anxiety domain. So I know she's got a high level of anxiety a high level of emotion. That emotion bears witness whenever she gets upset. She flies off the handle. She gets condescending. She gets pushy and has to have her way and demanding. And because of her intelligence and her dominance and her need for control, she gets condescending.
Remind me again of the range with the ER. What's the range on the scores?
1 to 10.
Okay,
So 10 being the worst.
gotcha.
So in our substance abuse study, 80% of the population had high anxiety, emotional resilience scores, and low self-control scores. Now look at her eye on the disc. It's non-existent, isn't it?
Right.
So it's all about telling people what to do and being in control. And the little things upset her. And because that L is so high and that C is so low, she doesn't bounce back and doesn't have the ability to see the humor in it. See how serious she is in her demeanor. So the owner said, well, we're going to give her a shot. We want to promote from within. We know she's got the talent. You're going to coach her. 6 months later, they fired her. Everything we predicted played out. This is the value in a sophisticated tool versus a simple tool. You see how that comes into play?
Mm-hmm.
Now, remember my gentleman, Dr. Ratton, I mentioned up in Connecticut that we did the substance abuse study with? This is a young man that had under his tutelage for counseling, and another coach up there named Robert Curry was the coach. We worked together jointly. Dr. Ratton said, I want you to run your analysis on my guy here. 26 years old, been fired from 3 jobs out of college. So look at the notes as I did my kind of diagnostic review. Look at my notes. I'm going to start top right. Bucks authority, party guy, defiant, bucks the system, flighty and impulsive, doesn't like to follow the rules, undisciplined and high strung, smart, needs a reality check, verbally sarcastic, tells you what you want to hear. This guy was in therapy. He has since overdosed. Do you see why? Do you see what's going on? Just from the little bit I've taught you so far, you wouldn't pick that up from the disc, would you?
No, well, yeah, this doesn't have that ability. Yeah.
So look at his need for change, the Q1 score. That's all about experimentation. Okay.
So Rick, when you talk about this gentleman overdosing, over the 20-something years you've been doing this, what's the level of accuracy around those predictions or those counseling you've given your clients in terms of those behaviors?
I've been over 95% accurate.
Okay.
So when I called Doc Ratton, he said, what do you see in the results? And this is what I read to him. He said, you're spot on. That's why he's in counseling. He said, I want you to come up here, whatever your daily rate is. I want you to fly to Connecticut. I want you to spend a day with this kid and give him his results and be part of the coaching piece with him. So I get there. Well, first of all, I told Doc Neal, I said, look, I wouldn't trust this kid as far as I could throw him. He'll lie to your face. Why do you think I would say he'd lie to your face? Or what traits do you think are here that would suggest that I would comment that he'd lie to your face or be untrustworthy? Anybody got any idea?
Socially
He's a
bold,
sociopath. He's a
assertive.
sociopath.
Oh, he is that. Yeah. This is a narcissistic profile.
Yeah.
Number one. So see the E score of 10, the H score of 9, and the O score of 3 lends itself to be potentially narcissistic. But look at the F score and the H score, all about having fun, experimenting, and look at the G score. He thumbs his nose at rules and responsibility and respect for authority. Look at how smart he is. 36 on his inductive and deductive reasoning, 82nd percentile on his math and verbal. That's like getting 1450 on your SATs. But he's a head case and full of anger, full of aggression. But the thing is that the thing I've tried to help you understand is that if in a coaching situation, the reason that I don't rely on DISC as my coaching model is because it doesn't give me what I need to really drive the coaching engagement and to know where that threshold is between recommending counseling and where I think I can maybe work towards as a coach / counselor without getting into therapy. So I know where my lines are drawn and I know where the tests tell me my lines are drawn. So now I can determine whether or not this coaching agent can really get traction or whether there's too much for us to manage in that coaching equation to help make this work. So using a sophisticated, now this is his challenge report from the Hogan. See the excitable skeptical scales? Up here top, he's in the high risk factor. This is where I'll use additional assessments. When I think I've got some problems or challenges, I'll use my Hogan to come in on the dark side, which measures pressure under stress. I can't be an effective coach by just using a DISC or Myers-Briggs and just touching the surface. I've got to be able to get at the heart of where these individuals are really, where their triggers lie and where their challenges lie. And I need a sophisticated tool to do that.
So this is
Rick,
more applicable. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Susan.
Herb. No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, in terms of these tools, Rick, this is more of your more affluent companies, executives, because you're looking at another assessment here through the Hogan, right? So what are you talking about in terms of costs?
So when I do this full executive battery, it's anywhere from 800 to 1200.
Okay.
Rick, we've got a comment from Leslie in the chat box. And Leslie, I don't know if you want to build on it, but she says, this is interesting. We tailor multiple real life on the job preview tasks for specific leadership and teacher roles. Typically, candidates must complete written tasks requiring quick decision making under a timed period. Also included are 24-hour tasks and performance tasks. Lastly, performance-based interviews are conducted with all stakeholders, students, faculty, staff, and leadership, and in some cases, parents. This comprehensive process over the last 14 years has yielded 2 bad hires total across nearly 15 clients.
Yeah, that's a much more sophisticated, that's referred to as an inbox process. It carries a much higher weighted success factor, but most companies, even some of the most high profile companies I work with, aren't that sophisticated. So kudos to you for.
That's so funny, particularly given the size of my company. Yeah, no, but I have to say, you know, most school systems hire staff based on a resume and a background check and an interview, which then I always say there's no surprise as to how no one can learn.
Yeah. Well, we just had the local school district contract us a couple of years ago to hire a superintendent, and we suggested not to hire. And a year and a half later, they asked for her resignation, and they called and say, "Well, we'll listen to you this time. Will you help us again?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
So,
you know, it is. I will say, it is kind of when you do this approach that I described. Pretty much what happens is that people who know they can't make it through the process don't even finish the first task. And that's even prior to, like, no one's been screened on a 15-minute call. I forgot that part. That's the second step. But there's a lot of stuff that happens before the 15-minute screening. And then the 15-minute screening, you're really only getting people who think they might make it through the process. And then from there, you go through these off-site performance tasks that are timed and presented under duress. People start falling apart if they can't make it through. And you know, when you have kids' lives at stake, you can't have people who fall apart. So, yeah, yeah. But
So
anyway,
Leslie, what is this? It's a multitude of different assessments that's brought together here, or that's just a okay.
and the thing is that we tailor them, so it'll be different for elementary versus middle and high schools. It'll be different for, like, we have a school that serves opportunity youth, which are the most disadvantaged and high risk student population. And theirs is they need a very different person. And so, yeah, so we actually we tailor the test or assessment to the school, and then we create rubrics based on those. And sometimes during the process, we have to adjust the rubrics based on performance along the way. So if we see something that's like, that we're like, kind of like, oh, okay, maybe that's a red flag. So then we adjust, we may adjust a follow-up task and also the rubric. So
one final question, the 16 PF that Rick just presented, is that aligned with the model that you're talking about?
No.
Okay.
No. That's why I was like, this is very interesting. I'm just trying to figure out how, I could see where, like using this, like, so let's just say, you're a district, like a large district, not like, but like, LA, New York.
Or New York for that matter, yeah.
Houston, like Chicago. And you've put out, and some of this is happening right now. I mean, teachers are retiring all over the place. And so I could see as a first rung, doing that. But what I hate about district hires is that they don't go much further. And, you get what you pay for. And the problem is that then once you're there for 2 years, you're tenured and you can't get rid of anybody. So.
Well, I don't want to cut the conversation short, but we are at the end of the session. And so I want to thank Rick for sharing his expertise and wisdom with us. I think these are some fascinating examples, and I would encourage anyone who wants to know more about this to reach out to him. He's got his contact information here. And, he did an assessment on me, I think the first year we met, and freaked me out a little bit, but it was really good. And I do refer back to it regularly. So, I think Leslie, your program sounds really comprehensive as well.
Absolutely. Kudos, Leslie.
Yeah. And I think there's, there's maybe an opportunity for us to have another discussion around assessments at a future point.
Yeah. Hey, Rick, great presentation. Thank you, sir. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Thank you.
I will be calling you tomorrow because I want to hear about this assessment on Susan. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.
Appreciate your time. All right.